Shalom, everyone, and welcome. I'm so thrilled to be with all of you today as we are learning Parashat Korach. So we're going to learn together in the way that we typically do when I am teaching the Torah study, which is we'll look at a couple of psukim pretty closely, a couple of verses pretty closely, and I'm going to weave in some teaching and commentary from people I've learned over the past week in preparing for today do so by setting us up a little bit for where we are for those who may not be following as closely the Parashat HaShavua cycle, the weekly Torah reading cycle. We are well into the book of Numbers. We are well into Sefer Bamidbar at this point, which in English, as I said, is known as the book of Numbers, but in Hebrew is known as the book of the wilderness, which I think is far more apt of a descriptor because our people right now, the Jewish people, are in the wilderness. Last week we had the dramatic incident with the Miraglim, excuse me, the spies, the scouts, and we also received a couple of practices around challah, around taking challah, and around tzitzit. So now we have moved from this place where the people are panicking and angry and don't know if they're going to be able to go up to the land, and ultimately the I don't know what we want to call it, the decree, the punishment, neither word sounds great to me, but the it was stated, we should say last week, that Bnei Yisrael was going to be in the desert, Bamidbar, for 40 years, 1 year for each day that the Meraglim were scouting. And that the generation to come would in fact go into the land. So we left off there. We left off with the commandment around tzitzit and the beautiful way of surrounding ourselves with mitzvot and remembering, Yitziat Mitzrayim. Now we turn a page, and this week we are moving into Parashat Korach, where we learn that Korach, who is the cousin of Aharon, Moshe, and Miriam, and 250 others, including Datan and Aviram, um, basically say to Moshe, who are you to be leading us? Why are you elevating yourselves above the Kahal? Aren't we all Hiroshim? Aren't we all holy? Why do you think that you are somehow holier than the rest of us? And the way that this goes down is very, very complicated and really nuanced and very layered and very difficult. Like all of those things, we can be with all of those things. And I encourage us when we learn Torah, that we learn Torah with our whole being. We don't just learn Torah with our intellect, we actually learn Torah with all of our being. And so everything that arises in Korach can be really hard. And there are a lot of commentaries on good leadership, and there are distinctive groups of folks that are punished in this week's parasha. You have those who are swallowed alive down to Sheol, who include all of the households of the men who are aligned with Korach. Then you have those who are burned because they offer incense that is not aligned with the offerings that Moshe and Aaron, and specifically Aaron, are offering up. And it's a very unique and interesting thing. How do we sit with both the kernel of truth that exists in Korach's claim, right? That Korach is basically saying, who do you think you are? You're elevating yourself above the people. You're not the be all and end all of leadership. Why not all of us? If we're all Hiroshim, we're all holy. Like, why do we defer to you, Moshe? Right? And that's a question, and at the same token, how do we navigate the consequences that befall Korach and his rebellion? What I think is really interesting is that in the book of Psalms, we're not going to look at the book of Psalms today, but just something to name. In the book of Psalms, there are many, many Psalms, including one that we say on Rosh Hashanah traditionally, just before the shofar service, just before we are really anchoring ourselves in that cry of the neshama that the shofar elicits, right? For some of us, it's just a loud, ram's horn. But there are numerous psalms that are considered to be authored by Livnei Korach, by the descendants of Korach, who were in fact Levites, so it makes good sense that there would be a lot of Tehillim attributed to them. But I think it's also a much broader point, which is something we're going to get to around community and being in community and not being in community, and thinking about how we are able to be in disagreement. What are the ways in which that disagreement manifests? Really, l'shem shamayim. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in Pirkei Avot. And a lot of this I want to say b'shem Amro, in the name of my teacher, Rav Shmuley Yanklowitz, who brought a lot of this in his commentary this week. So lots of kavod to him. But thinking about the ways in which Korach's rebellion, or Korach's, whatever term you want to use. There are a lot of different terms that are used to describe what happens, all of which have their own laden interpretations. So what I want to do today is, rather than focus on the chronology of exactly what happens and really digging into, Korach's claim, like how dare you, Moshe, elevate yourself above Bnei Yisrael among the rest of the Kahal? Aren't we all leaders? There are a lot of commentaries that say, well, that's easy for Korach to have said. After all, Korach himself was a Levite, right? And that's something that is actually brought up, that Moshe says later, like, but isn't it enough for you, right? Isn't it enough for you that you, as a Levite, been brought close to Hashem? You have this avodah, this sacred service. Is that enough for you? And that's a direct response to what Korach says, which is, you have gone too far, Moshe. You've gone too far. You've taken too much. And so it's a fascinating interplay. And rather than going there directly right now, I think what we're going to do instead, I'm going to invite us to do a screen share. And we're going to look at some verses, and I'm gonna invite a few folks to read. Please, if you are interested in reading, we ask you to please be ready when you are called on to jump in, just for ease of flow. And we're starting at 1620. We'll get there in a second. So if I'm going to give folks a minute to kind of find it on your screen, or if you have a printed Chumash, you might choose to use that, a printed Torah. But either way, we're going to be starting at verse 20. And so if you are interested in reading, please, when we call on you, feel ready to jump right in. I will pause you when it is time to pause. But I want us to think about this particular passage. We've been through the whole interplay between Moshe and Korach and Aharon. We're now jump to a passage that starts with verse 20. I'm really going to unpack these next couple of verses about community and belonging. So does anyone want to read? I'm going to turn it over if you want to raise your Zoom hand.
We will go to Erin. Thank you.
Toda Rabbi. Good morning from Toronto. Okay, so Yidaber Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon lemor. And God spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, stand back from this community that I may annihilate them in an instant. But they fell on their faces and said, El Elohai Hirot. O God, source of the breath of all flesh, when one member sins, will you be wrathful with the whole community? Vayidaber Adonai Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the community and say, withdraw from about the abodes of Korach, Dathan, and Abraham. Moses rose and went to Dathan and Abraham, and the elders of Israel following him. He addressed the community, saying, move away from the tents of these wicked men and touch nothing that belongs to them, lest you be wiped out for all their sins. So they withdrew from about the abodes of Korach, Dathan, and Abraham. Now Dathan and Abraham had come out, and they stood at the entrance of their tents with their wives, their adult children, and their little ones. Vayomer Moshe, Moses said, "By this you shall know that it was God who sent me to do all these things,
That's perfect.
that
We're going
they
to
are
pause right
not."
there.
Okay,
Thank you,
I,
Aaron. We may pick
I
back up in a moment.
sure. I'm going to push in a question. What does they mention fall on their faces several times? So I'm curious.
You have totally prompted exactly where we're going to go. So thank you for that. That was beautiful. I'm so grateful for your reading. And thank you for that question because it's gonna get us exactly to where we're gonna go. So if we look at this passage, I want us to look at 21 in particular, and I want to name in the Hebrew, it actually talks about separating, not standing back. The word in Hebrew is hibdalu, to separate, kind of like havdalah, right? Same root, to separate from amongst the community. And because Hashem literally, it says "V'achla otam kerega," literally, and I'm going to eat them in a moment, right? It's a fascinating and very disturbing image, right? And the people say, "Yiplu al paneha v'yomru al Elohei haruchot l'chol basar," like referring to, very interestingly here, the people fall on their faces, they prostrate. So when the Torah talks about falling on one's face, quite literally it means to prostrate on your stomach. So you're like lying down in full prostration where your arms and your legs are fully extended and your face is literally on the ground. That's what I understand the Yiblu al Paneham to mean. And they say to God, "Oh God, the God of all spirits and of all flesh, like the spirit of all flesh, like you are indwelling within us." Like just because one person, yachata, just because one person misses the mark, literally misses the mark, does that mean that upon everybody there's going to be this reactivity, right? So I want us to pause here on these verses for just a minute, and we're going to keep kind of going through this passage, right? Because one person, although in this case it's, Korach is joined by several hundred others, but Korach is the leader. Because one person does this thing, are you, Hashem, going to respond in such a dramatic way? And before we get into some comments and questions, I actually really want to take a few minutes to just think about that question, to think about what's going on here, like internally to our own experience, right? We have a scenario where Hashem says, "Separate yourselves," says to Moshe and Aaron, right? Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe Aaron, right? Separate yourselves from amongst the community that you have been leading and shepherding to this point, right? And because I am going to destroy them in a moment, I'm going to eat them literally. And presumably you are not part of that multitude. So I want you to be separated. And then Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces and they say, "Well, wait a second, Hashem, like why are you suggesting, right, using this very interesting name for the divine, Elohei Ruchot, right? The God of the spirits of all flesh, just because one person, albeit somebody who's close to us, right? Just because one person, our cousin Korach, Yachata, does that mean that the rest of us, does that mean that everyone is going to be impacted?" Let's pause here before we act in a rash way. Now we know, or I shouldn't say we know, in this parsha, there are tremendously rash and disturbing punishments. But I want us to get kind of under the simple meaning here of the text and really ask ourselves what's happening. There's a clear breakdown in communication. there is a clear, and as Aviva Lauer talked about in her podcast this week from Pardes, which I recommend if folks haven't heard it, the question arises, why at this point in the Torah, why does this happen now? Last week we had the incident of the scouts, excuse me, and now we've had before that in Bahalocha, we have the incident of the quail. We're gonna have more incidents. We're gonna have one next week in Chukat. It's gonna keep on going, right? And so, why is Korach happening now? Why is this challenge to leadership arising now? And one of the points that she makes, which I think is really apt here, is the idea that sometimes when we are set up for profound disillusionment or disappointment, because if we're thinking about last week's Parashat, Bnei Yisrael is told the current generation is not going to make it into the land, which is a profound disappointment. Their children will, but they will not. When you are set up for that kind of profound disappointment, sometimes in human behavior, and I think if we bring this down to the micro level of our own personal lives and our own human interactions, right? Sometimes we create more difficulty and suffering in our lives because we're already sitting with so much disappointment, right? We lash out, we create more reactivity, we cause ourselves a lot more distress than we need to. That could be part of what's happening here. That, it's already a profound disappointment, the whole situation of not being able to go into the land. So let's just keep it going. Let's delve into all of the things that are not right about this, and then we have that possibly is arising around Korach's uprising, rebellion, challenge, whatever word you want to use. And then we have God's reactivity in this narrative. If you just read, I've been thinking about this a lot, if you just read this parsha without any context or commentary, you could very reasonably walk away and be like, wow, the God of the Torah is terrible. And there's a lot of, stereotype around that the God of the Torah is a God of wrath and the God of other traditions is a God of love. And if you haven't read Shai Held's wonderful book, Judaism is About Love, where he deeply disabuses us of that idea, I really recommend it profoundly. If you just read the Torah without any context or commentary, you could very easily and very smartly walk away thinking wow, I want nothing to do with this. This is the kind of reactivity you're gonna one person Yechaten, the whole thing is destroyed. Wow. But let's be with that and get under it a little bit and ask ourselves, in our own experience of being human beings, how often do we engage in that kind of behavior, right? Or how often do we encounter it from others? And these are rhetorical questions for ourselves. These are not, to be shared in this space. This is a way of really relating to Torah in a deeper way beyond just what's happening in the words here. How often it's well, those people over there, they were wrong. So you need to separate yourselves from the community. And because I am, I'm at my wit's end, says Hashem, and I'm gonna destroy it in an instant. Right. And then Hashem, and then Moshe and Aaron are like, wait a second. Why? Why are you engaging in that way? And how is that okay? How is it okay that everyone should be impacted because of the consequences of choices that one person made? And I think also, we have the named Datan and Aviram, and they, their tents are ultimately people come to them and, engage in a very strong reaction and action around their participation in Korach's uprising. But I want us to just think about the ways in which this chapter is so much about miscommunication, and not to suggest, right? And I want to name that Shmuel Yankowitz in his commentary this week talks about this, not to suggest that the outcome is always, well, we should smooth over our differences and everybody should just be together and like, let's, shalom bayit and peace in the home, and that's great. And that's what there are a lot of ways in which people engage in that, because that is as aversive behavior as what Hashem is doing here, right? When I say aversive, what I mean by that is that if you decide to say, look, I'm going to either destroy this entire thing, which ultimately happens right at the end, where you have two different groups of people, one of whom is swallowed alive by the earth. And that, of course, terrifies those who survive that. And then you have those who are burned because of the incense, right? So it's a very, very difficult parsha that we absolutely need to sit with and really wrestle with. And it's also a sense the way that I'm understanding it this year, it's really an act of aversion. And aversion is a term that basically means turning away from, rather than actually sitting with and navigating and dealing with what Korach is bringing up, which there is a kernel of truth in it. Recognition of the kernel of truth is really important. It's easier to say, how dare you defy my authority? I'm going to just destroy this whole project. Similarly, there are others, not in this parsha, but in human life, who, when something arises that's really, really difficult, that's, Korach's uprising, Korach's challenge to Moshe and Aharon, we might have the impulse, which I think is a very strong human impulse, particularly for those of us who really are not fans of conflict, to say, yeah, but we can work it out. Let's just all live in peace together. And like, peace is a wonderful idea, by the way. I want to be very clear on that. I'm very in favor of peace, but in general, like in human relations, let's pretend that we're not engaged in differences of opinion. Let's just kind of sweep that under the rug. Let's pretend it never happened. We can all just move on as if this never happened. That in and of itself is also aversion, because it's also not grappling with what's arising and grappling with the choices that we have. As Rav Eliyahu Dessler, who's a very famous contemporary Musar practitioner, he talked about this notion of a bechira point, a choice point, which is the notion that every day we are confronted, we are faced with multiple choices a day. And within the amount of agency that we have, now this is my, commentary on his point. He didn't use this exact language. Within the kind of agency that we have, we can choose moment by moment how to react and show up in a situation. Much easier said than done. I can think of examples this week when I didn't show up quite the way that I would have wanted, right? But it's always an opportunity to return. And that's ultimately what I think this Torah portion is really teaching us, is like, when something arises that's really destabilizing, like super difficult, super destabilizing, we just want to be like, all right, I'm done. But in a moment, in a rega, in an instant. It's interesting that rega is translated as instant. I often think of it as moment, but still, in a very brief period of time, I'm just going to let it go because I'm so angry. What does it mean if we notice that and be like, oh, there are really good reasons. Let's really be with that. Let's turn towards it. Let's turn towards it and get under it and be with it, even though it's really uncomfortable, and then figure out a way forward, rather than either allowing it, which anger is a secondary emotion, right? There's usually something under it, rather than letting it overtake us and, create sort of like a sense of being short-circuited, or pretending that the anger doesn't exist. Many of us were conditioned into this way of being, right? Something arises that's really difficult. I'm feeling really angry. Well, I'm not supposed to feel angry. I'm going to pretend that that doesn't exist. I'm going to put that under the rug. We know, those of us who were, brought up that way, or who were socialized that way, that ultimately that just causes us considerably more emotional pain. So what I think is a really important lesson for our parsha is thinking about how different elements interact to create a conflictual situation that really spirals out of control when actually we might be thinking about communication and what are different choices that could be made, and also why are people compelled. And rather than trying to analyze, any of the folks in the parsha ourselves, we can also think about this in our own relationships, in our own ways of showing up in the world, and in our own the ways that we think about other people that may not agree with us, that may not align with us, who challenge things that we hold really dear. How easy is it for us to just want that thing to be one? And there are times, as I think is really important to say, everything is contextual, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Even though we don't quite know why chronologically Korach's rebellion happens now, I think that what Aviva Lauer suggests and teaches is really interesting and important. Nevertheless, I think that we have those times in our lives when we have to exercise very good, firm, and uncompromising boundaries. I don't remember who said this, but there's a beautiful quote that the idea is boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So it's a very intricate and important needle to thread between how do we get under the reactivity that arises? How do we understand what's arising for us? And how do we also set the boundaries in the container that we need to be in right relationship? Those are things that I think are really arising. And so for the remainder of our time together, I want to open it up to comments and questions. And the way that we'll do this, please keep your comments and questions as concise as possible, because we want to hear from as many folks as possible. So what I want to invite folks to do is to either write into the chat. I'm going to actually invite us to first look at the chat if there's anything interesting there. And then if people have comments that they would like to offer verbally, you can also do that at this point.
I'll give people a moment to either type in their questions or raise their Zoom hand. Great. Thank you, Erin. I know that you read for us earlier. We'll see if we have time, but I'm going to go to Andrea for now.
I hope this addresses what you're asking in some way anyway. This is the third time in just a few weeks of the Torah reading. First the golden calf, and then the regalim, and this when God wants to destroy the whole Bnei Israel, and Moses always talks him out of it. The first time it's, what did you bring him out here for evil intent? And the second time is basically, what will the neighbors think? And this time it's an idea of not punishing everybody for what happened. But Moses never makes that idea of, these people might have been really scared by these giant people with fortified homes. Maybe building these people up is another approach. I'm kind of taken by the fact that this happens over and over again. Well, at least 3 times that I can think of. I don't know if it's more. And that question of this might be a reasonable response of these people who were slaves for all of their lives, might have. So I don't know if that's trying to get at what you're asking, but that was what I was struck with in reading this.
Andrea, that's beautiful. That's exactly it, right? I mean, think about, we also even have back in Exodus, we have the manna where the people are like, okay, so I've had this miracle, you freed me. Now I'm in this like desert and there's nothing to eat. What is happening here? Why is there nothing to eat? So like over and over and over again, right? Over and over again. It's like, what's happening here? We don't have enough to eat. You're not the right leader. We're not going to ever make it into the land. Next week we're going to have another one. It's going to keep on going. And I think exactly that, like, right, exactly. Like this is a reasonable response for folks that have gone through a change of such magnitude that, I mean, I even feel strange trying to imagine what that was like because I don't have lived experience of it. But if we just try to drop into the experience of the Israelites. They've been slaves for most of their lives. They've not had power and agency in any meaningful way over their time. Now they're being told, okay, so trust that, you've been freed and that's this amazing thing. And now you're going to have this leader, Moshe, who is one of you, but wasn't raised with you. So, but trust him as a leader and it's going to be fun. Like, of course, it seems very reasonable to really wonder about that. And I think that that's something to really sit with of like, what is the reason behind, Korach's rebellion, right? And, we have the stated call, we have the stated reason, which there's a lot of truth to, but I'm so curious about his backstory. I am so curious about the family dynamics. Right, I was reading a commentary about the Halacha, which was our Parsha 2 weeks ago, where they were talking about the family dynamics between Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam, who are all siblings, mentioning in this particular teaching that it may have been the case that actually Moshe and Miriam did not have a good sibling relationship. And they talk about how that shows up in the 12th chapter of Numbers, where Miriam is talking about Miriam and Aharon are speaking very badly about Moshe's wife. And they pick up on a textual thing where it's like, why is Miriam referred to as the sister of Aharon only? I mean, yes, as the sister of Aharon only. And again, like there's so many pieces here, and we get a particular manifestation of when those things bubble up. And when we read the Parshiot as we are, especially in Numbers, but also everything you mentioned, like these things just keep seemingly happening over and over again. And I think what it allows us to do is ask ourselves, oh, what's going on here? With compassion, rather than with vura, right? Rather than with judgment. I'm just going to destroy this whole people. Like I've had it. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. Let's drop that. It's a really easy place to go. I know in my own experience, right? If I really tap into my own experience, it's a really easy place for me to go when something arises that is very difficult. And if we just kind of allow ourselves to be like, curious about why are the people doing this? Well, they have a really good reason for it. I think that that's very right on. So thank you. And I'm gonna stop talking and I really want to hear from all of you. So any other comments or questions in the chat or verbally?
We will call on Jack.
Yes, I see this Korach story as being on two levels. One is a personal level. After all, he is also a member of the priestly group, but right before that, he's told he's a second-class citizen compared to Aaron and Moses. He can't even touch any of these things until they wrap them up and he's given directions. So for 200 plus years, these people have been slaves and have had no ability to exert their own influence over their own lives. They're told they'll be free, which means free to do what? Free to have someone else tell them what to do. And I see this as an effort to not only deal with one's personal feelings about this, may he feel inadequate, but as a human being, we want to exert some direction of our own lives, and they find themselves in the same position that they were under Pharaoh. There was really no difference as far as them exerting an ability to control their own lives and to control their own decisions.
Yes, I really appreciate that. I think there's a lot there for us to unpack. And I think it's true that from their perspective, reasonably, there is really no difference. And to add to that very briefly, and then we'll take the next comment, they don't, I mean, first of all, Korach is a Levite, is the cousin of Moshe and Aharon. They don't know Moshe. Moshe wasn't even there. And all of a sudden now he's the leader. it's totally understandable from their perspective why they're like, why should I follow this guy? Yeah, thank you for that, Jack. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Yes, we'll go to Lenore.
Shalom, everyone. As a descendant of, as African American or African descendant of slaves, I see the empathy everyone is having now for Korach and the Israelites in the desert. And I look at us as a people who look like me, with my skin, and who have been in slavery for 200 years plus and continue, and there are laws in place that keeps us there. And yet still, I find sometimes you look at the America, which I now live in, and you look at the lack of empathy sometimes for the struggles of people that look like me, or people who, at least with the Israelites, they knew who they were. They had their God. They remembered their God of their forefathers. For us, we don't have our God. We don't have a language. We have no memory, you know, and, you know, I say to myself and I say to others when I get confronted, can you take a look? We read the same book. How could you see it in Torah, not see it in your life here today? You know, how can you pass such judgment without taking a look at the history? That's my thing. I'm sorry. Kind of brings tears to my eyes. But I love Torah.
I am so glad, Lenore, that you shared that. Thank you so much. That's really important. And I just want us to take that in because I think that that's extraordinarily true. And I think people are really good at turning away from what's right here and thinking about empathy, you know, for those who feel far, because we don't want to turn towards what is right here, and we don't want to acknowledge what is right here. And it's very important that we do, and particularly everything you said is so important for us to all take in, and particularly the severing of connection that you name between those who were forcibly enslaved in the Americas, and particularly in the United States, with lineage. And that is really important. And building up an acknowledgement, a recognition of struggle ongoing that didn't stop, that continues, is something that if we're going to take Torah seriously and we're going to be responsible interpreters of Torah, we have to do. I believe that's critically important for our own religious integrity as we're learning Torah. And it's often convenient and easy to look at these texts and say, well, this is ancient and it's far away, so I can have whatever distance and engage in like an intellectualizing without actually engaging with this, with what's right here. So thank you so much for that. It's really important. And I really want us all to take that forward into Shabbat and going onward from there. And wow, we have a few minutes. So do we have any other comments in the chat specifically or verbally?
We have 2 raised hands, and the chat, as always, is sort of its own conversation. So there's people asking questions and responding, and
Okay,
so I think we will call on Harry and Noreen to ask hopefully concise, short questions, and then we will turn it over to Rabbi. We'll go to
perfect.
Rabbi first.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Just one statement I wanted to make is, I guess I'm drawn to Torah. I'm drawn here because there's, as a man who grew up in this culture, I'm an American, so I don't really agree with the comments of being a second-class citizen or ever consider being a second-class citizen. I've never felt that even being a man of color, that I was any different than anybody else in America. I know the history of America and things have happened, but just like the Jews and what we're reading now, they were overcomers, and they never let them bother them. And when things happen in Israel, they just go about it and let it. And like if something else was happening, it can be bombed one minute, but they're overcomers. And I feel the same way. I don't feel that I'm any different or any special because what happened to me 300-400 years ago. I live in the right now, but I'm blessed by what I'm blessed by right now because I can't do anything about the past. I can just reminisce to the future. I mean, it's not hard. I don't understand the downtrodden as people of color. That's all I had to say.
Thank you for your comments. You said we had one more person.
Yes, we'll go to Noreen.
This rebellion is different. This rebellion wasn't about the issues or their situation or their, the fact that they were where they were. They didn't care about how to handle the situation. They didn't discuss those things. This was a rebellion this was a rebel without a cause kind of situation. But it's just a question of who was going to be the leader. That's all. We're in the same situation. We don't care about the situation. It's just who's going to lead us. And that's a different problem than just what they were faced with at the beginning, where are we going to get our water? Where are we going to get our food and so on? It's, this argument was not for the sake of heaven. This was for the sake of, I want to be the leader. That's different from what they've confronted before. So.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your comments. And I wish we had more time to really dive into it because I think there's so much that was surfaced in both of them that really deserves a lot more time and attention. So with a lot of regrets, we're going to be closing in a moment. I wish we had more time. It's sort of like there's never enough time to learn all the Torah and to hear all of the beautiful Torah that emerges from the community that we need to hear. But I just want to thank everyone, first of all, for your comments, your engagement, and also just for taking the time to learn today. I think it's really important to grapple with everything that arises in Torah and these texts and our own experience and our own understanding of experience and our own, ways of relating. All of that is really important. And I'm glad that all of it was able to be surfaced because that's it. Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, right? All of these are the words of the living God. And, thinking about machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven, actually, interestingly, in Pirkei Avot, in the chapters of our ancestors, the rabbis say that an argument that was lo l'shem shamayim, that was not for the sake of heaven, was that between Korach, was that of Korach. So that's interesting to think through. But I think that there's a lot that we can learn and take forward in this. And I want to thank everyone for being in this learning together this morning or this day, wherever you are. And thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom. And I hope you, and Chodesh Tov also. We're about to enter the month of Tammuz. So happy, good Shabbos. And I hope you have a very good and happy Rosh Chodesh as well.
Thank you, Rabbi. And in our 1 minute, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask, we have some people in the chat who are saying, what do you do if you're finding yourself in your own midbar, in your own wilderness? So will you give us either some words of strength or maybe a blessing as we go into Shabbat?
Yeah, a lot of us are finding ourselves Bamidbar these days in our own wilderness. I think that that's a common experience and something that I really try to do in my own practice. It probably has come through in my shiur today, but I'm very devoted to contemplative practice in a Jewish framework. And so something that I really try to do is just try to recognize that. There's a beautiful teaching from Rabbi known as the Piazetzna, Reb Kalon Kalman Shapira, who perished in the Shoah, who died in the Holocaust, but has a beautiful idea of something called the Mafteach L'Neshama, the key to the soul. And he talks in one of his books called B'nai Machshava Tova about this notion of what happens when something arises in our experience that is distressing. often we want to turn away from that thing. Often we don't want to fully open to it, because if we fully open to it, that's really difficult. So he gives some examples. We might decide to engage in a nap. We might have some alcohol. That's an example that he gives. We might eat something. We might try to distract ourselves. But I think in those moments when we're feeling that tug of something going on, that, as he calls it, it's a mafteach l'neshama. It's a key to the soul. It's a way our soul is crying out for something. So just to try to, minute by minute, and again, this is really difficult because like sitting with hard stuff is really hard. And I know in my own experience, like often what I want to do is shut that down and do something else, But if I can take just a minute, right, or like even 10 seconds to just be with that and build on that, over time, I think that can be a really beautiful way to navigate the midbar, and to just acknowledge that that's where we are, and that's it, that we are where we are, and even if we wish we weren't, this is where we are in the moment.
Thank you
But we
so
can grow.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. For those who've been joining us for 3 years, for those this is their first time, we hope to see you next week. And Shabbat Shalom to all. Bye-bye.